through who Loren is and some of his impressive accomplishments. So Loren BirdRattler currently serves as the project manager for the development of the Blackfeet Nation's Agriculture Resource Management Plan, a plan that will create policy in agriculture, land, conservation, water resource management, holistic management practices, as well as agriculture and livestock regulations for both the Blackfeet tribe and the United States government. Loren was recently also hired as the endowed chair for the Native Studies Department here at MSU, where he was working with the Native Studies Department to create an Indigenous research initiative that will align Native-based research at the Academy with tribal priorities. Loren has more than 20 years of public and private sector experience in organizational development, strategic planning, policy development, project management, and civic engagement. He is a former National Field Director for the Native Vote Initiative for the National Congress of American Indians, a public program specialist for the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of the American Indian, both in Washington, D.C. He was also a program manager for the United States Department of Defense's Native American Lands Environmental Mitigation Program, based in Arlington, Virginia, for CARES Consulting. He served as the inaugural executive director for two nonprofits, Western Native Voice and Montana Native Vote, both based in Billings, Montana. Loren has received the President's Medal for Social Embeddedness from the Sandra Day O'Connor School of Law at Arizona State University, and has been a guest lecturer for the Kennedy School of Government and the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard. Most recently, Loren has presented at the National Forum for Large Landscape Conservation and the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues at the United Nations, both on indigenous approaches to natural and agriculture resource management, conservation, and climate adaptation. Loren grew up on his family's ranch 40 miles south of Browning on the traditional homelands of the Blackfeet Nation. So let's give a warm welcome and a round of applause.
Well, thank you very much. I certainly appreciate it. And thank you all for being here. You know, I think when we think about, the 1:30 session right after lunch, it's a little bit hard to, move into that space after getting a full belly. So I certainly appreciate that you're here. Before I start, I do want to acknowledge my team. And so if you're a member of the ARMP team or a former member of the ARMP team, can you please stand up? So I get the wonderful opportunity. Where's Katie? Katie, you better stand up. I get the wonderful opportunity of working with these young folks, right? These folks, right? And so, I just get to be the deliverer of the message, right? It's these folks that do so much of the heavy lifting. And so let's give them a round of applause, please. Thank you so much. And then I also want to thank AERO. What a fabulous agenda, right? To choose, which session to go to, it puts people in a very hard position, right? Because it is a stacked agenda. So I appreciate all of you joining me for this session. And so as Madison mentioned, my name is Loren BirdRattler. Oki Nitsdanagu Bita Hiahuiniwa. My Blackfeet name is Eagle Pipe. I received that name by making correlations to repatriate Blackfeet bundles and put them back into use for Blackfeet people or the Blackfoot Confederacy. And so, I'm very proud of that name. As we look at indigenous methodologies and approach to indigenous lifeways, we want to take what we're doing with 15,000 years of methodology and move that forward and allow it to manifest in a modern context. So everything that we do has to be Blackfeet driven. And so I also like to start my presentations with a few quotes, right? Whoop. So the first one is tribes will never attain true sovereignty without first attaining food sovereignty. As we think about what that really means, the ability to grow your own food, the ability to move into that space, right? You never saw the challenges that exist in Native communities today before the changing of the food system, right? So as we reclaim that space and indigenize it, if you will, it has very many, it has a lot of primary application, right? So as we think about creating translational models that can be duplicated in other Native communities, those models can also be duplicated in non-Native communities as well, as we think about utilizing that traditional ecological knowledge and substantiating it with Western science instead of the other way around. And so, I'll get into that a little bit more as I speak. And then the second one, you can read those, but the second one that I really want to emphasize, I heard at a food sovereignty summit that Danielle actually spoke at. And so, and that was from a Native Hawaiian elder. And what she said was, when our hands are faced up, we will always be hungry. When our hands are face down and we're working the earth, we'll never be hungry. So it's very similar to the biblical, teach someone to fish rather than giving them a fish, right? Native people were never, ever, ever, ever in our entire history dependent, right? We were always independent. We always provided for our families, provided for our tribe, provided for everyone, right? And we weren't dependent until you saw a change in the food systems, right? So again, as we reclaim that space, hopefully my presentation today will give you a little bit of context in how we're actually accomplishing that. And so I did also want to preface that all of the photos in the presentation are from Blackfeet country. So this is our E&E, right? Which is how we say bison, right, or buffalo, depending on which continent you're on, I guess. And then, of course, those are natural wetlands in Blackfeet country. So, so in terms of the chronology for today's presentation, I'll be talking about Blackfeet ways of knowing, right? Blackfeet ways of being, Blackfeet ways of planning, how we utilize that to inform everything that we're doing. I'll be talking about a Western authority, right? That's the legal framework that we need to operate in, right? And how you can build many things on that legal framework, right? I'll be talking about the role of the Blackfeet tribal government, right? And how that informs and supplements everything that we're doing at the local level. How we plan from a holistic place. As we think about holism, right? You hear about it all the time, right? But at the very end of the day, very few people are doing it because a holistic approach does really recognize interdependent functions and relationships in a larger system, right? So as we think about that larger system, there are a few people doing it because it's so darn complicated, right? A Western approach or a Eurocentric approach is to really take a slice of that system, research it a lot, right? Try and control it rather than looking at how we utilize natural process to inform modern management concepts. And so I'll also be talking about our current projects, Blackfeet Food Sovereignty, our Blackfeet Food Code, or the policy framework that we're utilizing to create that foundation for everything that we're doing, the necessary partnerships, and then of course at the very end, the roles of funders, NGOs, nonprofits, and higher education. And so that will give you a nice walk through everything that we're doing at Blackfeet country. I do want to also disclose that it's a lot of information, right? So I'm going to probably come at you like a fire hose. That's what a lot of my colleagues say, and so, as we go through it, and if you have any questions or anything, comments, I want you to jot them down because there will be time at the after the presentation to really have a discussion around many of those questions. And so, but hopefully, if I present accordingly, right, then I'll be answering many of those questions as we go through the presentation itself. So to really understand Blackfeet, right, or Nitsadapi, right, our real people, right, you have to understand that we're part of the Blackfoot Confederacy. And so we're the only tribe in the United States, Amskapi Pagani, right, that's a part of the Blackfoot Confederacy. We have three tribes on the northern side of the medicine line, the Guyana, the Siksika, and the northern Blackfoot. And so as you think about that, that becomes very important as I move on into the presentation, as we think about international trade, the ability to, utilize international trade umbrella to really market Blackfeet products at a much higher rate. Presently, our original homeland, actually this map is a little bit misleading, right? Because it went all the way to here, right? Then went up to the Saskatchewan River. So all of this area was traditionally Blackfeet as well. So as we think about the Lame Bull Treaty, right, and where we're at today, right, I always like to acknowledge the indigenous people from the areas that I speak at, right? So this was originally a part of the Blackfoot Nation after the Lame Bull Treaty, right? And then after the Fort Laramie Treaty, it became common hunting ground. So the original Blackfeet Reservation or Blackfeet Nation, I'm trying to move away from reservation because it's colonized, right? The Blackfeet Nation, straddled the Continental Divide, came all the way down, took in half of Yellowstone National Park, and then followed the Yellowstone River to the Dakota border and then back up to the Canadian border. That was the very first Blackfeet Nation, right? So it's very important for us to remember that because it allows us to understand the history, right? And how history informs everything that we're doing in a modern context. And so we're larger than the state of Delaware, about twice the size of Rhode Island, right? So we only have 2 Rhode Islands in the Blackfeet Nation, not 91, right? As we listened to the presentations last night. We're about the same size as the island nation of Puerto Rico. And so we don't have the senators and the Congress people that represent those jurisdictions. We have a 9-member elected body that really is almost an oligarchy, right? So as we think about tribal governments, right, and democracy really did come from tribes, right? The Iroquois Confederacy, population distribution, the longhouse, right? The clan mothers, the judicial system, the chiefs, the executive branch, right? The first, the beginning of the Constitution, right? Our forefathers is verbatim, right? From the Iroquois Confederacy, right? You know, and so as we think about that, right? And how that was regurgitated and then sent back to tribes, right? You know, we ended up with without a separation of powers, right? So as we think about how that stifles economic development, it's very important to understand that history, right? You know, so we have a 9-member elected governing body that can, through a simple majority vote, overturn a judicial decision, right? You know, so as we think about outside investment, it becomes very difficult simply because if you can't adjudicate a dispute, right? You know, then there's very little trust in the system. So as we move to separate powers, there is one tribe here in Montana that does have a separation of powers. That's the Abzaliga, right? The Abzaliga Nation, the Crow Nation, right? They do have a separation of powers. They were the very last direct democracy in the Western Hemisphere, right? So as we think about Indigenous people and Indigenous governments and how we partner with them and how we utilize them in a modern context, the opportunities are endless. But it's also important to note from a conservation perspective that 80% of the large vertebrates in the state of Montana reside on the Blackfeet Reservation, right? You know, in terms of pure species numbers, right? You know, 55% of the biodiversity, right? So as we think about the conservation and the preservation of that biodiversity and how we market our products at a higher rate based on that biodiversity protection, we're moving into that space as well. We have 5 watersheds on the Blackfeet Reservation, Blackfeet Nation, excuse me. We have full water rights in terms of allocation to the 3 middle watersheds. We have shared rights on both the north and the south. So as we think about production agriculture, all of that, it's very important to understand, you know, where that water comes from. You know, we're also at the headwaters of the continent, right? You know, the original Blackfeet Nation water flowed in 3 directions, right? The northeast into the Hudson Bay, the southeast into the Atlantic through the Gulf of Mexico, right? And on the west into the Pacific Ocean, right? So that gave us access to the culmination of 3 different ecosystems and the medicinal plants and traditional foods from all 3 of those ecosystems, right? You know, and so as we think about that and being at the headwaters of the continent in a modern context, you know, we do have the cleanest water, the cleanest grass. We don't have agricultural runoff. We don't have any of that. So we can grow the cleanest food, right, plant or animal, right, in the country. You know, so that's very important to remember as we move forward and think about how we capture all of that and pull it together in a plan and implement those plans. We have 51,500 acres of wetlands, 175,000 acres of forest land, about 518 miles of streams, 180 bodies of water, many of them prairie pothole wetlands. So again, when we think about biodiversity protection, it's very important to remember these statistics, right? Because it helps us inform how we do land planning at a much larger scale. But first, right, you know, we have to think about, you know, what informs everything that we do. You know, so we had to go back, you know, into our own history to really define what our core values are and allow them to manifest in a modern context, right? So when we think about some of the great work that the Blackfeet Community College did in the 90s to really go out and talk with our elders and really get the pulse of the community around orthodox and contemporary approach to what our values are, we utilize those core values to inform everything that we're doing. You know, so that means that it's, you know, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, right? Not just 10 o'clock on Sunday morning and 7 o'clock on Wednesday evening. It's all the time, right? And if we practice these core values all the time and utilize them to inform what we're doing in a modern context, then all of those challenges around many things that come with planning begin to dissipate on their own, right? Because you're really planning from a true place, right? You're really planning from a real place. So of course, Blackfeet ways of knowing, Blackfeet culture, spirituality, and philosophy, thought and action, right? I just kind of explained that, right? Being a leader, professionalism, integrity, and responsibility in human interaction, right? Respect for oneself, all other people, all ideas, and each thing in the natural world. That becomes very important. When we did our E&E planning, right, we're doing the largest bison reintroduction in North America, right? When we were doing our E&E scoping, we kept that chair open for the E&E, right? Because it's up to every one of us in that room to speak for that animal, right? For those plants, right? For that water, for that earth, right? And if we can do that, right, then sustainability becomes naturally a part of everything that we're doing, right? So we need to remember that we have to respect all living things, and that includes water, the earth, the soil, right? Everything on it, right? Living in a good way, honest in all thoughts and actions, right? Trying hard, commitment, dedication, sincerity in the pursuit of all of our goals, right? Accepting everyone, embracing the unique talents and contributions of each individual. As Blackfeet, our traditional methodologies for teaching, right? When we think about teaching, right, we recognize at a very young age in our young people their natural abilities, their natural talents, their thought process, and we utilize that and move them into functions that were naturally conducive to them. Right, so as we think about how we utilize Myers-Briggs, right, which is based on Blackfoot physics, right, Myers-Briggs, right, and we utilize that to really think about how we do workforce planning, learning, teaching, all of that, right? That comes from traditional methodologies of Native people, right? As you look at Maslow's hierarchy, right, that came from Blackfoot physics, that came from Blackfeet people, right? And it really isn't a hierarchy, right? It's a circle. So there were key pieces that he was missing, right? So as we think about, being less extractive, right, and actually partnering and allowing indigenous-led conservations and indigenous-led approaches, it really allows us to put us in a space that is really equitable, right? And then happy living, humor, laughter, and enjoyment of life. We were just having this conversation, right? When you look at Indian country, we don't have a lot of capacity, right? So that means that the prom committee, right, it's not only decorating for the dance, right, but they're also doing all the fundraising, raising the family, doing many of those things, right? So if we're not thinking about how we expand that prom committee in Indian communities, right, then we're going to continue to see the challenges that mount today. Right, so we need to think about that, to prevent burnout, right? We need to practice happy living, humor, laughter, and enjoyment of life, right? So those are the core values that drive everything that we're doing, whether it's policy development, planning, whatever it may be, and I'll talk about some other methodologies in a second. But first, let's talk about that Western authority, right? Which is so necessary, right? A lot of us like to think that it isn't, right? But at the very end of the day, it is, right? So we draw our authority, or our Western authority, from this piece of legislation. It's Public Law 10377. It's the American Indian Agricultural Resource Management Act of 1993. And when you look at this legislation, it gives tribes broad latitude, and I mean broad latitude, right, to not only create a plan that's conducive to their needs, but also to implement that plan. But it also influences the management of agriculture and natural resources through the U.S. Department of Interior and the U.S. Department of Agriculture, right? And to a greater extent, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, right? So if it's in your ARMP, right, it's no longer a strategic plan, right, or a measurable goal or a measurable objective. It becomes a directive. And we all know how you can utilize directives, right, to really accomplish what you need, right? So as we utilize this framework, it's very important for us to utilize it to create that foundation that then allows us to think about moving into spaces like inspection, right, like creating our own standards, and I'll cover those in a minute as well. And so we take these are all requirements of the Agricultural Resource Management Plan, but the one that we take to heart is define critical values of the tribe and its members and provide identified holistic management objectives. That's what gives us broad latitude, right? So when we think about systems thinking or systems approaches, right, and that interdependent functions and relationships in that larger system, it gives us the authority to move into every one of those spaces, right? So it's real good stuff. So the Blackfeet Nation's ARMP derives its authority to supersede federal regulation, right, from the American Indian Agricultural Resource Management Act of 1993. So that's very important to think about as we move into the current projects that I'm going to talk to you about as well. But first, what is the role of the tribal government, right? What role do tribal governments play in all of this stuff, right? And it is a lot of stuff, right? So when I met with our tribal government, our 9-member elected officials, the first thing I asked them was, what role do you want to play in commercial production of food? Right? Do you want to compete with your people? Do you want to empower your people? What do you want to do? So we had a very lengthy conversation, and what came out of that conversation was what we refer to as the triple bottom line, which was really coined by my good friend Jill Mackin. So as we think about that triple bottom line, the first of that triple bottom line is how we create sustainable economics in Indian country, right? Indian country is at the behest of cyclical funding year in and year out. It's a public sector-based economy, right? So when we think about that public sector-based economy, if we're not thinking about how we create the conditions that allow the private sector to thrive, then we're going to continue to be at the behest of cyclical funding and dependence on the US government, cyclical funding, grant funding, all of that, right? So what we really need to be thinking about is how we create the framework that allows our people to move into private production, right? We always provided for our own people. We already mentioned that. We know that, right? But when we think about re-empowering them, right? At the very end of the day, we want our people, we want Danielle to be growing produce commercially, right? And sell into the schools. We want all of our people to play a role in that space. So when you think about challenges like access to credit, all of those things that plague small farmers moving into commercial food production, we can create the framework, right? And utilize our access to credit as a tribal government to do things like processing, right? Then we're leaving the real private production to where it should be, right? The empowerment of the people. And so, how we move into those spaces, right? How we become suppliers for our own food delivery systems, how we export all of our food and create that sustainable economic foundation. So all of that is a necessary component. So all of these three things, we have to have them present in everything that we do, in every grant that we submit, every proposal that we submit, right? Or otherwise we're just not doing it. And so the second, is how we narrow the health disparities of our people. Indian people die 20 years younger than our non-native counterparts. 20 years younger, right? So you can look at Danielle, right? You can expect her to live 20 years less than you, right? This young lady, 20 years less than you, right? And if that doesn't open your eyes, I'm not sure what will. Right? So if we're not thinking about how we utilize policy development, practical application, all of those things to really narrow the health disparity of our people from a holistic perspective, then we're going to continue to see the runaway health disparities that exist in Native communities, right? So when we think about the effect of that changing food system, right? That corporate farming model that took a piece of everything from every one of us, right? It allowed us to extend the shelf life, right? It allowed us to take advantage of convenience. It allowed us to profit heavily, right? So when we think about that, and we think about its impact on health, we know that 6 of the top 7 killers of Blackfeet people, you can directly correlate to that high fructose, high sugar diet, right? All that stuff, excuse me, I almost said something else, right? All that stuff, right? In the middle of the grocery store, right? All of that extended shelf life, right? We know that sugar creates inflammation, right? Leads to cancer, right? Number killer, Blackfeet people. It spurs autoimmune, right? Lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, other autoimmune diseases, heart disease, liver disease, diabetes, the list goes on, right? So if we're not thinking about how we, change the culture in the way that we grow food, the way that we purchase food, the way that we prepare food, and the way that we ingest food, right, then we're going to continue to see those runaway health disparities, right? We're going to continue to see systems that approach the symptom and not the actual challenge, right, or not the actual problem, right? And so we need to think about how we're utilizing not only commercial food production, right, but access to traditional foods, all of those things to really move the needle on narrowing health disparities in our community. I am going to mention one other piece, right? The university here did some research around omega-3 and omega-6. It hasn't become public yet or hasn't been published yet, but they did that in Crow Country, right? Where they gave Abzolugat kids, right? Omega-3 supplement over 6 months, right? And then utilized standardized testing to measure restorative cognitive function. Right, so over those 6 months, right, after those 6 months, and they tested those kids, right, the minimum rise in test scores was 28%, the maximum was 92%, right? So as we think about the achievement gap, we think about all of that, right, and all of that pop, all that sugar, all that candy, all that Kool-Aid, right, it's not only killing us, right, but it's also contributing to the achievement gap, right? So we need to be cognizant, right, about those things, right, and how we utilize those things to really change the culture again in the way that we grow food, the way that we purchase food, the way that we prepare food, the way that we ingest food. The third, right, is obviously the most, for us, the most obvious, right, and how many young people are here? Raise your hand. How many young people? Right? Well, we all are, right? But you're our future, right? So as we look at those correlations, right, there are two very important demographics, right, in Native societies, right? There's the elders, right, the wisdom holders, right? We don't just send them off to the nursing home, right? We capitalize on their wisdom because they have a whole lifetime of knowledge, right? And a whole lifetime of experience, right? And we have our young people. Right, so if we're not thinking about how we lower that median age of farmers and ranchers here in Montana, commercial food producers, right, we're going to continue to see that migration into cities, right? We're going to continue to see the economies of our small towns and cities dry up, right? We're going to continue to see the negative impact that's happening across the landscape in Montana, right? So if we're not thinking about how we instill that institutional knowledge into our younger people, right? And we don't just get it here at MSU. MSU really helps, right? But MSU doesn't teach you when you're pulling that calf, right, to turn it a quarter circle and come all the way out, right? So we need to ensure that that institutional knowledge is being passed down to our younger people, right? That know-how is being passed down to our younger people, right? And so that's our triple bottom line, right? And that's the role of the tribal government, right? To really create the environment, right, that allows us to meet these three things. So what are the challenges, right? What are the challenges around planning and implementation, right? What are the challenges as we think about creating partnerships with Indian communities, right? Well, the first is that, there's not a lot of capacity, right? There's a lot of knowledge, right? There's a lot of authority, right? One of the best lessons that I learned at the Smithsonian Institution, right, was that the real authority lies in Native communities, not in this collection, not in this workforce, not in folks that sit around and think that they know it all, right? And that's not a critique, right? But really it is in those Native communities. So as we think about the crossroads between traditional ecological knowledge and how we capitalize on 15,000 years of methodology, right? The first example that comes to my mind, a Hopi man did his dissertation, right, on Hopi methodologies for conservation, did a side-by-side comparison with NRCS, right? And guess what? Guess which is more efficient, right? Guess which is more holistic, right? Guess which has better soil quality, right? Guess which has better sustainability, right? So if we think about those methodologies, right, and we substantiate them with Western science, rather than taking Western science and trying to shove it down the throat, right, of indigenous communities, right, then it puts us in a space to where we not only have an equitable partnership, right, but where we can learn from each other, right? Learn from each other, and so you really have to take off that arrogance hat, right? Because Western science and Western approaches and Western methodologies say, we know best, right? So we're going to tell you how to do it, right? And as a result, right, there was somebody that said last night, now that we know, plant ecology, we've known plant ecology for 15,000 years, right? That's why there's sustainability built in the way that we harvest, right? So as we think about those methodologies and we think about how we can utilize that, right, and create an equitable space, right, that isn't extractive, right, that doesn't take advantage, right, that doesn't take that idea or take that methodology and then create profitability from it, never giving back to that community, right, that takes that research, right, and actually puts it back in that community, right, that's a real equitable partnership, right? And so my hat here at MSU is to do exactly that, right? To create an indigenous research initiative that really aligns research here at the Academy with tribal priorities and not the other way around, right? That it really truly is equitable, right? Because we're not going to build capacity in Indian communities, right, unless we meet that head on, right? But so that means that we need, and I sure hate to sound like George Bush, right, but that means that we need a coalition of the willing, right? That means that we need to really capitalize on progressive thinkers, right, that are ready to move into that space and allow indigenous-led partnerships, right? But you have to understand the current stressors to tribal governments, right? We can create measurable goals, measurable objectives all day long. We can call that community all day long, but you have to set foot there, right? You don't just get $5 million from NIH and then just do all your work here, right? No, those days are coming to an end, right? We need to build Native communities. And if we do, that $25 million that comes in for Native research here at the Academy will turn into 50, then it'll turn into 100, then it'll turn into 200, right? Because we're doing things the right way, right? Not just the way that we think is the right way from an institutional perspective, right? So I always do that one a couple times, right? Just to make sure that, we're all still awake, right? It is after lunch, right? You know, so, but it's mostly to get you dizzy so we can take advantage of your funding streams, right? I'm just kidding. So as we think about methodologies, right, you know, we tend to utilize this one, right, you know, because when we think about that holistic approach again, right, it really moves knowledge to action, right, creates knowledge again, right, to action, right, you know, so it's never ending, right, you know, that's why we do things in circles, right? So when you think about it from a quantum physics perspective, right, you know, there are about 6 different planes in a circle, right? You know, in a linear approach, there's just one, right? So as we think about how we really take advantage of that, right, and really utilize native methodologies to really inform what we're doing in a modern context, it allows us to take that 15,000 years of experience and of know-how, right, and move it forward to meet all of our challenges in a modern context, right, from a true indigenous approach, right? So by 2029, we envision the Blackfeet Nation fully engaged, informed, and actively involved in the development of holistic agricultural resource management for the economy, the environment, and the health of the people, land, flora, fauna, and water. Together, we will work to embrace our natural laws, values, relationships based on respect, trust, and healing. The ARMP, by the way, is Agricultural Resource Management Plan, right? It's one of those government acronyms, right? Will provide a means for establishing reciprocal partnerships among producers, businesses, and landowners to increase international access and availability of quality Blackfeet agriculture products. Our Blackfeet youth will have mentoring opportunities to learn from elders, producers, and leaders to contribute their voice to a quality Blackfeet way of life. Right, you know, so that, you know, embodies many things, right, you know, and that gives us that larger vision, right, you know, so as we think about that larger vision, we can all be visionary, right, you know, but how are you going to get there, right, you know, if you're not asking the question of how you're going to get there, right, you know, then we're all just great visionaries, right, you know, and so this is our vision, right, you know, so, and you all get to look at that, you know, so I think that what I'm going to point out is that everything that we do, again, is informed by Begunny values, right? And it looks at stakeholder participation and new information, right? The crossroads of those two things, right? If we do things that are community developed, right? If we implement community developed plans, oh my gosh, it isolates you from controversy, right? You know, I mean, you know, because you can then say, you know, this came from our people, this came from our farmers, this came from our ranchers, this came from our medicinal plant gatherers, right? From our traditional food preparers. So, how do we plan, right? You know, and so first we ground our planning in Begunny values and stewardship of the land, right? You know, when you look at health, well-being, all of that, when you look at indicators, all of that, you know, everything that we do is tied to the land, right? So when we really think about health and well-being from an indigenous perspective, right, it really centers around stewardship of the land, right? You know, and so when we think about land, we think about it in the broad context, right? You know, the biodiversity, the water, everything, right? You know, the second is that we make our plants in-house. Ensuring that, so when we think about making our plants in-house, right, you know, it then again speaks to that need to build capacity, right? You know, we can outsource plants all day long, you know, and you can look at outsourced plans all day long, right? You can look at government created plans, higher education created plans, right? You know, but they're usually lacking two things, right? You know, they have measurable goals, they have measurable objectives, but they don't make correlations to human capital, right? Who's going to do the work? Right, you know, and they don't make correlations to a timeline. When is that work going to be done? Is that FY20, FY21, right? Is it the first quarter, the second quarter, the third quarter, right? When is that work going to be done, right? So when we think about raising the probability for implementation, right, you know, all of that starts through the methodology in your planning process, right? And if you have the right methodology in your planning process, then implementation of your plans become much easier, right? You know, so we have to think about building that capacity for tribes, and we have to allow them to not only lead that conversation, but to develop their plans in-house, right? You know, and then we collaborate with our people, right? You know, I mean, there's a novel concept, right? You know, heaven forbid we have stakeholders at the table, right? We have beef producers, we have grain growers, we have pulse crop growers, right? We have medicinal plant gatherers, traditional food preparers, right? We have recreationalists, right? You know, because when they're all at the table, right? You know, it is a little bit in the beginning, right? You know, but then, you know, it doesn't take too long to find common ground. right? It doesn't take too long to find common ground, right? But by having them all at the table, right, then your probability again for implementation goes way up, right? And then we use high quality data, right? If we're not thinking about how we create data for tribes, right, and allow them to own that intellectual property, right, then we're going to leave tribes continually at the behest of U.S. or federal government systems, right? You know how hard it is to access IHS data, NRCS data, FSA data, BIA data? It's like pulling teeth, right? I mean, it's even harder, right? So as we think about moving into those spaces, we need to be thinking about how we create that data at the tribal level so that we can substantiate need, right? And then the fifth is we recognize both traditional and modern land use and livelihoods, right? That is really the crossroads between the practice of who we are as Blackfeet people, right, and modern food production, right? I mean, you could look at that in from many different lenses, right? But at the very end of the day, it is, again, ensuring that we recognize everybody that's utilizing the land, right? Not just those that we want to be utilizing the land, right? How everybody utilizes the land. We engage in necessary partnerships to plan, right? We have a partnership with MSU, right? We have a partnership with University of Montana, with NGOs, with the University of Arkansas, with Guelph University in Ontario, right? With many organizations, right? Because as we supplement those gaps in terms of capacity, right, we can utilize this, right? But they must be equitable partnerships and they must be Indigenous-led, right? Otherwise, we end up trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, right? From the institution side, right? Or from the outside in, right? So we need to think about fitting a round peg into a round hole, right? I mean, geez, that's not rocket science, right? And we do that by allowing many of those partnerships to be Indigenous-led. We make sure that our plans are implementable. I think that I already covered that. And then we learn how to plan better, right? We have to have the latitude to make mistakes, right? Because many of this is new from a Western perspective. It isn't for 15,000 years worth of methodology, right? But from a Western perspective, it's new. Right? It's new, right? We're moving to new spaces, right? You think about research, you think about everything, right? That low-hanging fruit, that new knowledge exists in Native communities. It's not new knowledge for us, right? But it's new knowledge for dominant culture, right? So as we think about the evaluation component, right, we need to have the latitude to change horses in midstream, right? To switch strategies, right? We need to have that latitude, right? And so that means that we need to think about Indigenous methodologies for evaluation as well, right? We can do a logic model, that is a tree, right? And look at all of the roots as all of the functions, right, in that logic model, right? We can do things from an Indigenous perspective, right? That still meets the needs or the requirements from a Western context, right? So what does that really mean, right? How do we get there? All of that kind of stuff, right? So this is what we're trying to accomplish, right? At the very end of the day, right? Commercial food production, health and well-being, food and land access, culture and traditional foods, right? As we think about meeting all of those challenges in Native communities, right? If you allow Native communities to lead that conversation, right? We can redefine delivery systems, right? We can redefine the food delivery system, right? We can redefine the health delivery system. And the reason we can redefine those spaces because tribal governments are pretty much underdeveloped, right? They don't have all the codification, right, that you then have to change, right? So we can create that code. We can create that policy, right? Tribes can enter into their own international trade agreements as quasi-sovereigns, right? Absent the United States, right? We can create those standards for organic, those standards for grass-fed, those standards for medicinal plants, traditional foods, native seeds, right? As we think about those spaces, right, and the creation of those standards, we can move away from the influence that sole profitability has on that entire process, right? And redefine it. That's the opportunity of partnerships in Indian country, right? Because you are dealing with tribal governments that aren't fully established, right? So the opportunity to do pilots, the opportunity to do many things, right, is immense, right? So how are we going to get there? That's right here on the right? What correlations are we making? These are our strategic pillars, But first, if we don't think about the real foundation, right, and how we unravel the jurisdictional complexities around trust land management, right, and make that land more productive, right, from an Indigenous perspective, right, then we're going to continue to see the challenges and the economic suppression that exists in Indian country today. So once we unravel those jurisdictional complexities, and we're working with MSU, the Native Land Project, on many of those challenges as we speak, right, then we'll be able to look at how we preserve our biodiversity and still create sustainable economic development and higher profitability through how we grow those foods, right? So the opportunities are endless. So implementing our vision, right? These are the current projects that we have. We have many in the hopper, right? As we look at the implementation of the Blackfeet Agricultural Resource Management Plan, right? We're currently working on the E&E initiative, right? E&E reintroduction and cultural revitalization, right? How we utilize that from a prevention perspective, right? How we utilize that in ecology, how we utilize that in sustainable and regenerative grazing, right? So as we think about the reintroduction of that bison and the role that they played in traditional grasslands, right? We're working on two I'll move into that under Indigenous-led conservation, but it allows us to really look at that large reintroduction, right? As you look at a Western approach to conservation, it usually waits until we deplete resources, then really scrambles to restore them, right? The opportunity in Indian country is that we do have 80% of the biodiversity across the globe, right? 80% of the biodiversity across the globe, 80% of the biodiversity across the globe, right? On 25% of the landmass, right? It allows us to be proactive, right? Rather than reactive. It allows us to create partnerships that preserve that biodiversity while still allowing for commercial food production, sustainable economics, right? We're working on a Blackfoot Prime label. We're working on an agriculture co-op and a confederacy-wide beef label, right? So as we think about the creation of those standards, right, we can utilize them in the third piece on that, the multi-species processing plan, right? So as we think about our own organic standards, right, we're looking at, sprouted fermented grains rather than any antibiotics, right? If you look at current organic standards, right, there still allows antibiotics, right? So it truly isn't organic, right? So as we think about how we market those products, right, and how we utilize that framework to really create much greater marketability for the commercial food production that's going on, it really allows us to move into that space as well, right? As we think about that multi-species processing facility, we're about halfway through that feasibility study, right? As we think about a holistic approach or indigenous approach to the dressing of animals, right? We want to utilize that entire animal and not just the desired parts, right? So that leaves options for value added, that leaves options for byproduct, that leaves options for many things, right? As we think about that more holistic approach to processing, right? We're working on our local food delivery system in November or January of this past year. We completed the strategic planning for a 5-year food sovereignty strategic plan that is really tied to the ARMP, right? And so all of its objectives become a part of the ARMP. So when we think about that directive, right, we're utilizing that to the end, right? And how we create the directives for many of these initiatives, right? We're working on international market access. We just completed an international market study that really looks at the viability of Blackfeet products in international markets, which I'll cover in a minute. How are we on time? Oh, we have 15 minutes. Okay, we're working on Indigenous-led conservation, right? We're in the middle of a feasibility study that really explores 2 Blackfeet conservation areas. The first, a Blackfeet National Park, that will allow us to collect gate fees that will underwrite necessary government functions in agriculture and natural resource management. We just finished a legal review with the University of Montana School of Law to really look at the applicability and the ability to collect fees on state highways. We just finished with the Montana State Tourism Bureau a survey that really looks at the viability of Blackfeet tourism, right? The willingness for people to visit a Blackfeet conservation area, the willingness to sleep in a teepee, the willingness to have Indigenous guides in hunting and fishing in all of those spaces, right? The second part of that feasibility study is to look at a prairie land designation that will preserve our prairie land grass species, right, for beef and bison production. So as we look at the front end of that omega-3, right, it really is in those native grass species, right? We look at the back end, right? The benefit to closing the gap in health disparities. Indigenous-led conservation becomes a critical piece to that, right? The need to partner becomes a critical piece to that as we look at underwriting these major initiatives and redefining many of those spaces, right? We're working on GIS inventory and mapping. Our good friend Andrew here from Cornell is working on arable and irrigable lands in Blackfeet country and watershed management planning, right, and biodiversity protection in natural process, wetlands creation, right? So as we look at natural water storage abilities, as we look at indigenous approaches to water resource management, right? Wetlands creation, all of that we can create in the western part of the nation, right? That then supplements the eastern end in terms of production agriculture, right? Gets late season flow, right? All of that in terms of irrigation. We're going back to the drawing board, right? And taking those methodologies and moving them forward in a modern context. So as you think about many of those systems, right? You know, and the ability to create wetlands, right? The ability to green as we update the irrigation infrastructure and make it more green. You know, we have a great opportunity to create hydroelectric power through that system, right? You know, and so it really truly is a holistic approach. So as we think about the GIS inventory and mapping, traditional foods use and occupancy, we're also working with state lands, right? You know, to exercise our treaty rights in public areas in that original Blackfeet Nation so that we have access to species that were lost in our 1.5 million acres. We may have 55% of that biodiversity, right? But we really do want 100% access, right? You know, so as we think about entering into the MOUs and playing a larger role in the management of those public lands, we can do that as a tribe because we do have reserved rights. We do have legal precedents, right? You know, so we want to begin to exercise that and utilize that as we move forward. You know, as we look at that feasibility study for the beef bison processing plant, we're assessing available livestock supply, right? You know, we can look at other tribal production, right? Rocky Boy, Fort Belknap, Fort Peck. And so as we decolonize, right, and we reestablish those trading systems that were in place prior to Western movement, prior to Manifest Destiny, we supplement that with indigenous methodologies for resource management across the board. It gives us the opportunity to then supplement each other's economies, right? So as we think about your tribal government role again, right, and that access to credit, we can be working on beef and bison processing in Blackfeet. We already have a food grade pulse crop processing plant in Blackfeet, right? We can look at grain milling in Rocky Boy. We can look at hemp hemp processing in Fort Belknap, right? You know, so as we think about, you know, the role that tribes can create and the resurrection of that infrastructure, right? You know, you know, I mean, you can find Blackfeet cultural items as far south as the southern tip of Peru, right? You know, so we had very intricate trading systems, right? So as we think about that, right, and we think about the resurrection of those trading systems, again, you're utilizing our history to really pull forward and allow it to manifest in a modern context. We're looking at the plant design right now. We're evaluating the market opportunities, and we're hiring additional specialists, right? So I know you're available, and I know that you're available, and I know, Bruce, where are you at? I know you're available, right? You know, Bruce actually sits on our advisory board for that processing plant. So this is the timeline of where we're at. You know, we're partnering with the National Center for Appropriate Technology out of Butte. They're doing some real good work for us. So this is what that timeline looks like in terms of the feasibility study for that beef bison processing plant. So when I do say how are we going to get there, you know, we really do have plans, right? You know, and not just the vision, right? You know, we just recently had Paul Darby at our ARMP meeting Wednesday past. We had presentations by Paul Darby, who resurrected the Virginia poultry industry, right? You know, he was key on the Quapaw beef bison processing plant, which was the first plant on Indian trust land, right? You know, so he's a part of our team, right? We also heard from Ron Dorr, a local manufacturer of sustainable containers, right, or self-contained growing units. So as we think about the diversification of our production profile, we'll vicariously diversify our economy and move away from being dependent on the beef market and the grains market, right? You know, so as we look at produce production, as we look at other commercial food production opportunities, omega-3 rich food production, right? Camelina, chicken feed, omega-3 eggs, you know, as we look at all of those things, right, it gives us the opportunity to really move into that space. And so we have a really good team that we put together that really has some good credentials, right? Right now we're looking at ranch numbers, large and small, the types of grass-fed systems that are being practiced. We just recently submitted a proposal to look at regenerative grazing from an indigenous perspective, right? So as we look at how we redefine grazing, right, you know, and align it with the practice of who we are, right, you know, we can pull and dust off some of those methodologies and allow them to manifest in a modern context, right? And so, and I won't get into the full details, but this is everything that we're trying to accomplish through that feasibility study. And so we're looking primarily right now at Glacier and Pend Oreille counties and obviously the Blackfoot Confederacy in Alberta. As we think about the Blackfeet inventory, we put about 40,000 head of cattle. Here's another good example about health and nutrition, right? We put about 40,000 head of cattle into the feeder market every year, right? It's grass fed, right? We send it to that feedlot, right, where it becomes corn finished, right? So that omega-3, so when we think about that omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, right, in our traditional hunter-gatherer diet, 1-to-1 ratio, right? And grass-finished beef, grass-finished bison, 2-to-1 ratio, right? But once you send it off to that feedlot and it becomes corn finished, 58-to-1. Right, 58-to-1 ratio, right? So as we look at all of these things, right? The impact will not only be for Blackfeet, right? But it'll be for the region, right? So as I mentioned, we finished our food sovereignty strategic plan by 2024. We'll improve access to affordable, nourishing foods within our local food delivery systems to promote healthy living by leveraging natural biodiversity, Amskapi Pagani ecological knowledge, local agriculture production, hunting, fishing, and gathering practices through teaching youth, honoring our first foods, and establishing effective policy and partnerships, right? So when we think about that policy development piece, it becomes critical, right? Because it becomes the framework for implementation. And that's Blackfeet country too, right there. So as we think about implementing our vision, right, we looked at the food assessment that Fast Blackfeet did, and we took a lot of data from that, right, to really inform the development of the plan. So as you think about, access to food deserts, all of that, healthy food, cost, right, all of those things, we can look at, taking 15% of that inventory to that beef bison processing plant, putting it into our local food delivery system at cost so that we keep the cost down, so that we keep affordable omega-3 rich food, right, available to our community, right? And then look at higher profitability through our regional and national and international exports. I'm kind of running out of time, so I'm not going to go into too much of this. We can have an offline conversation. But at the very end of the day, our strategic pillars around the food sovereignty plan are to develop tribal and local food sovereignty policy, invest in practices that promote food sovereignty and self-sufficiency, engage youth in the community in food sovereignty education initiatives, and build and align local and regional partnerships in support of food sovereignty. So again, tribes will never be truly sovereign without first attaining food sovereignty. This just goes into greater detail. In terms of our international marketing study, we looked at import and export numbers for key markets that we want to enter into. We did an ease of export rankings matrix that really looked at import standards for many countries, right, and explored the applicability for us to move into those markets, right? We know that Hong Kong is an easy market to get into, and it has a lot of people, and they love omega-3 rich beef, right? Omega-3 rich bison, right? We looked at South Korea, right, as another option. We're keeping a very close eye on Brexit and Great Britain. We all know that U.S. producers aren't allowed in that Great Britain market, but guess who is? Canada. So as we think about that international trade umbrella, right? We have the ability to export out of Alberta directly into Great Britain, right? And so we're keeping a very close eye on Brexit as well. Eventually we want to be able to meet the standards to enter into the European Union, because I think that when you think about that, cleanest water, cleanest grass, all of it, right? We absolutely have the ability to move into that space, but as we build capacity, we'll start small and then move into that space. And so a lot of that comes from that information that we're receiving through that international market access study. As we look at the food code, we're in the process of customizing a model food code that was created by the University of Arkansas School of Law, right, that really defines the safety standards for commercial food production, right? So when we think about from a jurisdictional perspective, right, there's the U.S. government, there's state government, there's tribal governments, right? State governments are fully codified, right? And I'll give you an example, right? There's an example of the Health and Safety Code, and I think I cut off about 35 chapters, right? Here's the Blackfeet Slaughter Code, right? So when you really think about the ability to shape, right, that policy framework, right, that gives you a good example of the spaces that we're moving into. But how are we going to get there? We can't get there without necessary partnerships. I see some of you getting a little bit tired, so I'm going to wrap this up real quick. So we're currently partnering with all of these folks, and that's just to name a few, right? And those are some of the things that they're working on, right? So as we think about our ARMP partnerships, right, and the ability to leverage resources across the landscape, it's very important for us to not only reach out, but through those partnerships, we're going to build capacity in Blackfeet country, right? So I encourage all of you to be thinking about how you not just involve Native people in all of your projects, right, but how you recruit them, right, and how you build that capacity, right, because we want them to come back to our community, right? If we're ever going to curb that sieve of rural people going everywhere else, right? It starts with us, and it starts here, right? And it starts with every one of you that's sitting in this room, right? We need to be thinking about how we're collectively honing and molding. And, I usually create my teams from seasoned veterans and new people, right? Because the new people you can mold. Unfortunately, my seasoned veterans went south, right? So I ended up with a whole team of young people, and we were able to accomplish this with a whole team of young people. Right? With a whole team of young people, right? So that's the opportunity, right? That's the vision, right? That is that correlation to how we instill institutional knowledge, right? So I encourage all of you to be thinking about that and how we mold them and put the Daniels back into our community, right? Ready to go, that speak both languages, right? That understand traditional methodologies and understand the importance of them and have that Western background as well. So what are the roles of NGOs and nonprofits, higher education, right? It's to allow Indigenous-led spaces, right? It's to supplement those efforts, right? It's to support those efforts, right? It's to create grants that have budget equity, right? That have FTEs that are based in Indian country, right? So when we think about it from a greater extent, right, we want to ensure that we have budget equity, right? That we have, that we're supporting FTEs that are based in Indian country, right? That we're allowing longer timelines for process and relationship building, right? That we're supporting tribal sovereignty, requiring non-Native and sub-award organizations to make real partnerships that are community-led, right? Not just Indigenous-led, but community-led, right? That we're translating to other contexts and regions, right? So that means that we're creating translational models that we can not only duplicate in Blackfeet, Crow, Northern Cheyenne, right? But also in non-Native countries, right? Non-Native counties as well, right? So as we think about, how we all work together to create a better Montana, right? It's up to all of us in this room to really think about the crossroads, right? Between, again, Western science, right? And traditional ecological knowledge, and how we utilize that to supplement or to substantiate, right? Not to dictate, that we're building lasting capacity and investment in our youth, that we're crossing boundaries and jurisdictions. We put together the Blackfeet Invasive Species Steering Committee, right? We brought together the U.S. government, right? Under Interior, right? There's National Park Service, Bureau of Land Management, Bureau of Reclamation, Bureau of Indian Affairs, right? Under BIA, in invasive species, right? Under BIA, there's range, irrigation, roads, right? Under county governments, there's weed districts, conservation districts, road, right? For both Glacier County and Pend Oreille County. Under the tribal government, there's anyone that disturbs the land, right? We brought them all together and said, what are you guys doing? Right? Do you have short-term plans? Do you have long-term plans? We want to see them, right? And what are your budgets, right? So now we're moving to a universal one reporting system where we can all input information, extrapolate information, right? We have the counties doing the spraying until we ban it, right? We have the, so as you look at, the ability to ban pesticides, herbicides, right, all of that, right, and move to a more natural approach to commercial food production, we're moving to that space as well, right? But getting back to the invasive species, right, we have the counties doing the spraying, right? We have the NGOs, the nonprofits doing the hand pulling, especially in riparian sensitive areas, right? So by leveraging our resources and working across organizations and governments, right, we're not only stretching our dollars, right, but we're working together, right? There's the novel concept, right? And so, cross boundaries and jurisdictions, right? Promotes truth, reconciliation, and alliances. So with that, thank you.